All right, you've got to hear this one. Picture this. It's late 1932, Western Australia. The actual Australian military rolls out, armed with Lewis machine guns, ready for a fight. Their mission? To declare war. And their enemy? A bird. Nope, not kidding. A formal military operation was literally launched against a giant flock of emus.
And just listen to this quote. This wasn't some kind of joke. This was the official assessment from the guy in charge, Major G.P.W. Meredith. What's wild is that you can almost hear the baffled respect in his voice, right? The military went in thinking this would be a cakewalk and came out talking about their feathered opponents like they were armored tanks.
So yeah, that brings us to the big question of this whole thing. How on earth did this happen? How does a professional army with machine guns get completely outplayed, humiliated in the papers, and, ultimately defeated by a bird? Well, the answer is this incredible story about economics, desperation, and just a massive misunderstanding of nature.
See, a conflict this bizarre doesn't just pop up out of thin air. It was really the result of a perfect storm. It was this chain reaction where the echoes of World War I and the shock of the Great Depression created the exact right conditions for one of the strangest military campaigns in history. To really get it, we've got to rewind a little. After World War I, Australia wanted to reward its returning veterans, so it gave them land to farm. The catch? A lot of this land was pretty marginal, really tough country out in Western Australia. Then, bam, the Great Depression hits. The world economy just implodes, the price of wheat tanks, and all those government promises of support, they just vanished. So these decorated veterans, guys who had survived the horrors of Europe, were now facing total financial ruin at home.
And here's the thing, this wasn't just some secret problem. The government kind of knew the whole system was a house of cards. A government report from 1929 had already sounded the alarm bells. It laid it all out. The farming scheme was unstable, profits were disappearing, and the farmers were getting angry. This whole situation was just a powder keg waiting for a spark.
And that spark? Well, it arrived on two very long, very feathery legs.
We're talking about an army of about 20,000 emus. There was a bad drought happening in Australia's interior, so they started their migration toward the coast, desperately looking for food and water.
And what do you think they found? They found all these new farms. To the emus, it must have looked like paradise, an all-you-can-eat wheat buffet with unlimited water. For the farmers, who were already at their absolute breaking point, this was it. This was the final straw. They begged the government for help, and in a move that seems just wild today, the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce, actually agreed. But here's the key. This wasn't sold as simple pest control. No, it was framed as a real military engagement, a way for the government to look strong and show it was doing something for its struggling veterans.
So, the stage was set. You have 3 soldiers led by Major Meredith set out with 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammo. They figured, hey, this will be quick and easy. That confidence, it did not last long.
And this right here, this slide just perfectly explains the whole problem. It was a total tactical mismatch. The Lewis gun, that's a weapon for trench warfare, right? It's designed to mow down big groups of soldiers standing still. But the emus, they were a totally different kind of enemy. The second the soldiers opened fire, that giant flock didn't just run away together. Nope. They scattered into a million tiny groups sprinting in every direction at almost 30 miles an hour. It was like they were using guerrilla tactics. They were this decentralized, unpredictable force of nature, and the army's centralized firepower was basically useless against them.
And the army's attempts to adapt were, they were almost slapstick. They tried mounting a machine gun on a truck to chase the emus down, but the ride was so bumpy they couldn't aim. And in this one now famous moment, an emu actually got tangled up in the truck's steering, which caused the driver to lose control and crash right through a fence. You just can't make this stuff up.
As you can probably guess, the press had an absolute field day with this. Newspapers all over Australia and even in Britain were just mercilessly making fun of the whole operation. Politicians started joking that if any medals were going to be handed out, they should go to the emus, because, as one of them said, they had won every round so far.
Okay, so let's look at the final numbers, because this is where the failure becomes so incredibly clear. Over the entire operation, the military fired almost all of their ammo, nearly 10,000 rounds. And after all that, what was the result? Major Meredith's official report claimed a pathetic 986 confirmed emu kills.
But here's the real kicker. If you do the math on that, it comes out to more than 10 rounds of machine gun fire for every single emu that was killed. It was just a staggering, breathtaking display of inefficiency. The military officially withdrew in defeat.
So the war was a huge public embarrassment. But the farmers' problem was still very real. So after this very public faceplant, the government had to go back to the drawing board and find a solution that, actually worked.
And what they figured out is pretty telling. They moved away from that big, centralized military approach and started thinking about smaller, practical solutions. First, they brought in a bounty system, basically paying private hunters for every emu. And after that, they landed on the simplest and by far the most effective solution of them all: just building better fences.
And look at this, the numbers just speak for themselves. In only 6 months, that new bounty system led to claims for over 57,000 emus. Compare that to the Army's 986. A decentralized, market-based approach worked way, way better than top-down military force. In the end, the problem was solved, not with firepower, but with simple, boring, effective infrastructure.
But the legacy of this whole thing goes way beyond just farming. It's this perfect snapshot of how the emu status completely changed in the Australian mindset, from a hated pest to a protected national symbol.
And this timeline just shows you how huge that shift was. I mean, think about it. In 1922, the emu is officially classified as vermin. 10 years later, it's the declared enemy of the Australian Army. And yet today, this is the very same bird that's on the Australian coat of arms, a symbol of the nation moving forward. And by 1999, it becomes a formally protected species. That is a complete 180.
So when you boil it all down, this was never really just a funny story about birds, was it? It was a story about desperate people pushed to the absolute edge by economic forces they couldn't control. It was about a government trying to look powerful in a time of crisis. And maybe most of all, it was a really humbling lesson that you can't always solve a complex ecological problem by just pointing a gun at it.
And that really leaves us with this powerful question that's still so relevant. What happens when the tools we've designed for human warfare are used to try and fix the problems of the natural world? The Great Emu War might sound like a joke, but it's actually this potent and, pretty comical cautionary tale.